The New York Giants fired their head coach Brian Daboll on Monday after the Giants have gotten off to a really poor start this season. And I'll tell you what, this firing, it does impact the Miami Dolphins in a pretty major way. And I'll describe why. There are three impacts specifically that I'm going to comb through throughout today's show. I am Nick Roloff. Well, here's the kind of overall summary, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty, if you will. Well, one, the Giants are going to be searching for a new head coach, obviously, and that could impact Miami because the Dolphins could be looking for a new head coach themselves in January and February. But maybe Brian Daboll is also the target for Stephen Ross to replace Mike McDaniel. But if that's not the case, I do think it's likely he joins a division rival. We'll get to that here at the end of today's show, so stick around. But I want to go into the first impact more directly because there are going to be a lot of teams looking to find a new head coach this upcoming offseason in January and early February. There are already two teams that have fired their head coach in season, that being the Tennessee Titans getting rid of Callahan, and then the New York Giants obviously firing Brian Daboll. So there's at minimum going to be two teams looking for a new head coach, but I think there could be as many as 7 teams looking to hire a new head coach. Miami obviously included. If they go off the rails and finish the year 4-13, I'd have to imagine the new GM ultimately hires a new head coach. Heck, the new GM might hire a new head coach even if Miami puts up a respectable 7-10 for the 2025 season. But I think the Falcons could move off Raheem Morris. I think it's very likely the Browns fire Kevin Stefanski. I think with how weird it's been with Jonathan Gannon in Arizona, he could be fired. And I am not putting it past the Las Vegas Raiders to fire Pete Carroll after 1 year because that's been an unmitigated disaster this season after Carroll brought in Geno Smith and a bunch of other personnel and coaching hires that he really liked. So there could be up to 7 open places for new head coaches this upcoming offseason, in my opinion. And if you want more on the Miami Dolphins, news, highlights, updates, go follow me over on X at Nick_Roloff. It's the handle. Tweeting about the Fins and the NFL every day, so go check me out over there. Impact numero dos when it comes to the Miami Dolphins. I think there is a decent chance that if Miami did fire Mike McDaniel, they could hire Brian Daboll as his replacement. But they could also, if they keep McDaniel, add Brian Daboll to the offensive staff because he does have familiarity with Tua. Talk more on that here in a second. But let's look at Daboll's head coach career in New York because he was the head coach from 2022 to 2025 this season. He did not have a very good track record. He had a really good start to the campaign in New York, turning them around and making them a playoff team with Daniel Jones, where they ultimately won a playoff game against the Minnesota Vikings on the road. And it ultimately led him to being voted as the coach of the year in 2022 by the Associated Press. And he actually has had experience in Miami. If you are not aware, he was the offensive coordinator for Miami in 2011, but when they fired Soprano that year, I always want to call him Soprano for some reason, Joe Philbin, the head coach in 2022, did not ultimately retain Brian Daboll, but then he bounced around to the Chiefs as their OC. And then once they hired Andy Reid, they did not retain Brian Daboll, but then he went to go join New England, where he won a couple Super Bowls, and then went to Alabama. And that's the key part here. He was the offensive coordinator in 2017 with Tua and Jalen Hurts under contract on that team. And that was the year that Tua came in and subbed in and ultimately won a championship at Alabama. Then he joins the Bills to be the OC for 3 years and then is the New York Giants head coach. And I got to be honest, if you look at Daboll's track record here, you're almost guaranteed to improve offensively every year that Daboll joins a new team. That team gets better on the offensive end of the field. Be serious. Like, you look at Miami, they went from the 30th ranked offense to the 20th ranked offense in that 1 year under Brian Daboll. We'll look at his tenure in Buffalo as the offensive coordinator, but they got better over his track record. They also got better at Alabama offensively when Brian Daboll was there. In the first year he was in New York with Daniel Jones, it was a renaissance year for the quarterback, and obviously now he's a potential MVP candidate. But I wanted to bring up this point again here. Brian Daboll was the offensive coordinator in Alabama when Tua Tagovailoa was there. So he coached Tua. So he has experience working with him. So if it was either replacing Mike McDaniel or joining the offensive staff, there's already a good working relationship there and the familiarity. So that is another added reason why I do believe that Brian Daboll could be someone the Dolphins ultimately search for and look at to potentially be a next coach on this staff. And I have another potential idea coming up here, but this episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. The weather is changing, it's getting colder, but one thing that never changes is the feeling of being right. Keep the season rolling on PrizePicks by getting $50 instantly in lineups when you play your first $5. Just pay more or less on at least 2 player stats. If you get your picks right, you could cash in. Which players are going off? Which ones are overhyped? Make your picks in less than 60 seconds to turn your takes into cash all season long on PrizePicks. I have an entry for today's Thursday Night Football game. More than Breece Hall rushing touchdowns. Also receiving touchdowns can be included. More than Drake May pass completions and more than Travion Henderson yards on his first carry. With no Ramondre Stevenson, I think Travion Henderson has a pretty solid game and a pretty good first carry. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code CLNS to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code CLNS to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, it's good to be right. Now, I'm not saying this is what is going to happen. I'm saying this could easily be viewed as the succession plan for the Miami Dolphins. Like, say the new GM Miami hires, whether it's a Chad Alexander, Ed Dodds, different guy, it doesn't really matter. But you fire Mike McDaniel because the new GM wants to bring in his new head coach by himself and he picks one. What if he hires Brian Daboll as the replacement? Why do I think this is something that could make sense for Miami? I already mentioned the working relationship and familiarity with Tua and Daboll. Tua is going to be here for one more season, right? And Daboll could come in, could coach Tua, and with the thought already in mind, we're going to draft a quarterback to replace Tua, but because his dead cap hits so high, he's going to be either here's the bridge starter or backup, like Kirk Cousins, in 2026. And Daboll might be able to get the best out of Tua if they use him as the starter due to that working relationship they've had in the past. But Brian Daboll, in my opinion, is an elite evaluator of NFL quarterback play. Throughout his career, he has worked with elite quarterbacks, and he has been able to identify talent. Joins the Buffalo Bills as their OC. Turns around Josh Allen's career. Goes to the New York Giants. Has Daniel Jones' career year to that point before this season in 2022. And he was the person who pounded the table for the Giants to draft Jackson Dart. Heck, I think if it was up to him, he would have drafted Jackson Dart with the 3rd overall pick in this year's draft. I think it was widely known that Daboll was in love with this kid. And they ultimately traded up for him in the first round to get him. Joe Shane didn't even want to do that. I think it's actually ludicrous that the Giants fired Brian Daboll and retained Joe Shane, at least for now. So what if Miami brought in Daboll, let him coach with Tua for a year, and then him and the new GM helped identify the new QB1 of the future, whether it be drafting one in this year's draft, a Mendoza, a Ty Simpson, a Dante Moore if he comes out, or identifying the quarterback they draft in 2027 for the future. If there's one person in the NFL that I would trust to correctly identify an elite young quarterback prospect, I think it's Brian Daboll. It's also widely known, by the way, the Giants wanted to trade up in the 2024 draft to draft Drake May. They wanted to go up and get Drake May, who's been obviously balling out in New England. New England ultimately said no. The Giants stayed put and took Malik Neighbors. So I trust him to identify QB talent. Well, let me know your thoughts. Pinned comment on today's show. Would you hire Brian Daboll to replace Mike McDaniel in January? Type Y for yes or type N for no. I have given him a lot of compliments throughout today's video on terms of his offensive mind and identifying quarterback talent. I still would not fire Mike McDaniel to hire Brian Daboll. Because to me, if I'll be honest, I think Mike McDaniel is actually a better version of Brian Daboll. Now, I can't speak to McDaniel's ability to identify talent at the quarterback position in the draft because Miami's obviously had Tua for the entire time, and they've never drafted a quarterback higher than Quinn Ewers or Skylar Thompson in the 7th round. So if you are going to move on from Tua, I actually think giving McDaniel a shot to identify a quarterback in the draft, I think is very fair. Now, if the Dolphins lose out and you fire Mike McDaniel, would I hire Daboll? He would certainly be on my list of potential targets. But if the Dolphins win 6, 7 games this year, are you making an improvement by going from Mike McDaniel to Brian Daboll? Probably not, because Miami's actually been a better football team over the last 3, 4 seasons when both of them were hired pretty much around the same time. Actually, the same time. So I would take McDaniel over Brian Daboll as a head coach, but if I could add him to our staff as a evaluator of quarterback play, oh my goodness, I would take Daboll as our offensive coordinator in a heartbeat. But the third impact that we referred to earlier as him potentially going to a division rival, I think is the most likely outcome of this entire situation, which is him returning to Buffalo to become the Bills' offensive coordinator. And you ask yourself, offensive coordinator, isn't Joe Brady really good? And isn't he a head coach candidate? He absolutely is a head coach candidate. I don't think he gets hired as a head coach. And also, I don't think he's that good of an OC. The Bills' offense is top 10 in the NFL, and it has been ever since he became the OC, yes. But when you really watch the Bills in the playoffs and over the course of the regular season, there are some head-scratching decisions made by Joe Brady. Whether it be 4th and 1 and doing a play-action rollout, which they did against Miami, or an end-around they did against the Falcons with Elijah Moore or Dalton Kincaid. And against the Patriots, they did that as well. Buffalo Bills fans want Joe Brady gone because of his play-calling decisions that are unexplainable at times. And I'll be honest, I could absolutely see the GM Brandon Beane and ownership in Buffalo ultimately listening to the fan base and firing Joe Brady if it meant they could bring in Brian Daboll. Because Daboll was absolutely fantastic as the OC of the Bills from his tenure in 2018 to 2021. He joined that team in Josh Allen's second year, and it wasn't pretty. Josh Allen was looking like a bust. They had a bottom-ranked defense or offense in the entire NFL. But then in Josh Allen's second year, they made a pretty big leap to the 24th ranked offense in yards per game and 23rd in points per game. And guess what? They made the playoffs that year. If you remember, that was the season they won double-digit games, and it was the wild card loss in Houston to Deshaun Watson and the Texans. But then they take that next leap. And this is where they became the elite of the elite, and they've won the division, the AFC East, every single year since 2020. They second offense, and then the top 5 offense in 2021. Brian Daboll legitimately saved Josh Allen's career because as a rookie, he didn't really play until the last couple months, and he looked horrible. And then through the first 6 weeks of the 2019 season, he looked even worse. I remember watching a game in person in Buffalo in September of 2019, and I thought Josh Allen was going to be borderline cut after that season. It was a September game. But then midway through that year, they just figured it out. And Josh Allen's been a top 5 quarterback in football ever since then and an MVP winner. And I credit that all to Brian Daboll. And the track record of Daboll being able to be a QB-friendly coach, it's just so large. It really is that you have to imagine he would elevate that Bills offense again. And I would despise him going back to Buffalo because I do think it would be an improved offense. Even if it's a top 5 offense now, I think they would be just as good in terms of their production, but they would be better in terms of their efficiency and their scripts within games, their situational play calling, if you will, because he is a damn good offensive coach. So to round out today's show, I'll say this. I really hope he doesn't go back to Buffalo, but this firing has major implications for Miami, whether they add him to their own staff, which I would love to do, or he gets back to Buffalo. I got to be honest, those are the 2 most likely outcomes in my opinion, because I do believe Buffalo would welcome him back with all arms, and I think Miami should think about adding him to their coaching staff in the offseason as well, whether it's replacing Mike McDaniel or bringing him in as an offensive consultant. I'll do it for today's show. We'll be back later today live on the channel, so subscribe and join us for that. And we'll be live for Week 11 Commanders Dolphins as well, so join the fam.